Everyone, and welcome to the fifth session in the CEDAW Convention Speaker Series. Today, we are looking at Article 5, and some of you might be wondering why. We looked at Article 5 last month. We looked at Article 5 with Bandana Rana with a focus on stereotyping and prejudice in particular. Today, we are joined by Rhoda Reddock from Trinidad and Tobago, who is a member of the CEDAW Committee as well, and she will be focusing on Article 5 and its use to address gender-based violence. We're really excited to have Rhoda here with us. Marion, are you?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
So Marion is, of course, Marion Bethel, our CEDAW Committee member from the Bahamas, and she will be bringing an introduction of Professor Rhoda Reddock, and then from there, Rhoda Reddock will get started, and we invite you to engage in the chat throughout the session. Feel free to do that. Over to you, Marion.
Thank you. Yes, well, it's great pleasure for me to be here today. And first of all, I just want to congratulate Equality Bahamas, Alicia Wallace, as the founder and leader of Equality Bahamas, for this groundbreaking and really invaluable series that we are engaged in. It is a resource, a current resource, and it is a resource for all times. And I'm so proud to be a part of this series and what Equality Bahamas is doing. So thank you. And so now to my friend Rhoda. I first met Rhoda in 1986 or 1987 when I went to Trinidad to attend a meeting of the Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action. So I was part of a local group called Dawn, and in the Bahamas, and we were trying to have an integrated work with CAFRA in Trinidad and Tobago. And so I was one of the members from the Bahamas who went to the meeting in Trinidad and Tobago, and that is where I first met Rhoda Reddock, who is a founding member of CAFRA, the Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action. And this is where I first got my real grounding in feminist action and advocacy from a feminist point of view for women's human rights and the rights of people in our community. And so I was really proud to be there and just challenged by all that CAFRA had to offer, including Rhoda Reddock. And it was at this time that Rhoda doesn't remember this, but she took me to the Trinidadian Zoo and for a visit. And this is where I first saw capuchin monkeys and I think red howler monkeys. And we don't have monkeys in the Bahamas, so this was really wonderful for me just to experience the Trinidadian wildlife with Rhoda at the zoo. And so I fondly remember that, and I'm trying to get Rhoda to remember that. But I just want to say how important and really pleased I am to be with Rhoda on the CEDAW Committee. Rhoda has brought a wealth of knowledge and information. Her expertise is phenomenal. She's a legacy already at this young age that she is in the Caribbean in regard to feminist work. And I am so proud to be engaged with her on CEDAW work. And we're both CARICOM Triennial Award awardees. And so it's really profound for me to have Rhoda as my friend over the past 4 years in Geneva, where we go 3 times a year. Rhoda, welcome, welcome, welcome. So Rhoda Reddock is Emerita Professor of Gender, Social Change and Development at the University of the West Indies and former Deputy Principal of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. She is an active member in the National and Caribbean Women's Movement and other social movements in the Caribbean. She is a founding member of CAFRA and is a board member of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence in Trinidad. She has served as a consultant and advisor to national, regional, and international agencies, including CARICOM, the European Union, Food and Agriculture Organization, the ILO, the United Nations Development Program, the United Nations Development Fund for Women, UN Women, the Global Fund for Women, and the Association for Women in Development. She is an active researcher and scholar, and she is the former president of the International Sociological Association Research Committee. And she is now an executive council member of the International Sociological Association. Professor Reddock is the recipient of numerous national, regional, and international awards, including the Triennial CARICOM Award for Women in 2002, and an honorary doctorate from the University of the Western Cape, South Africa in 2012. She is the project director of the Action Research Project and campaign, Break the Silence, End Child Sexual Abuse. Rhoda has numerous publications, including 9 books, 2 of which are award-winning, 3 monographs, 4 special journal issues, and over 75% of her work has been peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Rhoda, welcome, welcome, welcome to Equality Bahamas. Thank you so much for being here.
So thank you very much, Marian. And you brought back these memories about the zoo in Port of Spain. And I must say, even though I can't recall it, it sounds like the kind of thing that I would have done. And Marian, it was great working with you in CAFRA over those years, and an honor to be working with you again on the CEDAW Committee. And Marian has been my mentor and guide and helping me through this complex process. And I want to congratulate Equality Bahamas so much. I think that this is an excellent event, and it marks the 40th anniversary of the committee, and it also expands knowledge and awareness of CEDAW in the Anglophone Caribbean, the CARICOM region, where I think that knowledge really needs to be developed. So thank you, Equality Bahamas, for all the work you have done the entire session, which, as you said, is now available online for the future and for continuous learning. So thanks a lot. I also want to welcome all persons who have joined from the Bahamas and other parts of the region, and I look forward to your comments. So do I continue, or will the host come back in?
Sure, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So could you please allow me to share my screen?
You should be able to now.
Yes. Okay, thanks a lot. And I'd just like to say that, that just in case I lose bandwidth during the session, we have a number of backup arrangements. So this morning, I've been asked to speak on Article 5, especially Article 5's focus on gender-based violence. But before doing so, I really wanted to give a little background, because what I've noticed is that in every one of the sessions so far, the presenters have added a little to the background of CEDAW. So I wanted to go right back to the Global Human Rights Charter, the UN Human Rights Charter of 1945. And what I wanted to note is that women's human rights was established as a fundamental principle of the United Nations Charter adopted in 1945, where equal rights of men and women and the protecting and promoting of women's human rights was enshrined as a responsibility of all states. And I think this is because there were a number of women from various parts of the world who were involved in developing this UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was a response to the 2 world wars, the tragedy of the Holocaust, as well as the economic depression that had preceded 1945. So Article 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights applies all rights and freedoms equally to men and women and prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex. And these rights include equal pay for equal work, the right to health, and the right to education for all. So the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination, therefore, was the mechanism to really put into practice those rights that were enshrined in the UN Declaration. And in 1975, at the first International Women's Year Conference, which marked the beginning of the Decade of Women, 1975 to 1995, delegates present adopted a plan of action, which included a legally binding convention on women's rights. After 3 years of deliberations, CEDAW was adopted in 1979 by a vote of 130 to 0 with 10 abstentions. The convention was open for signature, ratification, and accession by the General Assembly Resolution 34180 of 18 December 1979 and was entered into force on the 3rd of September 1981, and the committee held its first meeting in 1982. I recall us in Trinidad and Tobago lobbying our own government to ensure that we ratified the convention prior to the Nairobi conference in 1985. Now, Article 5 of the convention states, and you probably heard that last week, but we can reiterate, the state parties shall take all appropriate measures to modify the social and cultural patterns of conduct of men and women with a view to achieving the elimination of prejudices and customary and all other practices, which are based on the idea of the inferiority or the superiority of either of the sexes, or on stereotype roles, that it should ensure that family education includes a proper understanding of maternity as a social function, not biological primarily, and the recognition of the common responsibility of men and women in the upbringing and development of their children, it being understood that the interest of the children is the primordial consideration in all cases. And I think it's very important that the convention and Article 5 does also have this component where it recognizes the common responsibility of men and women in the upbringing and development of their children. Now, Article 5 is a critical article as it addresses the deep-seated structures and ideologies that support and, most importantly, reproduce gender inequality. Because the thing about these gender equality is that it's part of a system. So the reproduce gender inequality, discrimination, and the devaluation of women and girls. And I think this is very important because the inequality, the discrimination is based on the devaluation of women and girls. So while this section is properly referred to as stereotypes in the committee, as you would have heard at the last session by my colleague, our colleague Bandhan Arana, the issues addressed by this article are much wider and include addressing the deep-seated stigmatization against women, the devaluation of women, for example, seeing women and femininity or femaleness as inferior and polluting, male privilege in personal and public life, and the violence and harmful practices that maintain patriarchal systems. Addressing Article 5, therefore, is critical for the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women and for the implementation of the other articles of the Convention. Article 5 also obliges states to eliminate all harmful practices based on the idea of the inferiority or superiority, as we heard a few minutes ago. As a result, Article 5 addresses the assignment of sole responsibility for childcare to women and the need to share parental work, the negative and detrimental traditional cultural. I would put traditional in inverted commas though, because Not all traditional practices were necessarily detrimental or negative. And not all cultural practices that are detrimental are traditional. So, but nevertheless, Article 5 addresses negative and detrimental traditional, cultural, customary, or religious beliefs, ideas, rules, and practices that control women's and girls' public and private lives. It addresses the undervaluing of women's contribution to society. It addresses the social and cultural behaviors and practices and ideas, and it recognizes the need for gender-informed socialization and educational practices. For example, curriculum change, gender-sensitive parental and teacher education, university-level women's and gender studies courses, etc. Now, why harmful practices? Harmful practices often relate to long-held cultural and customary practices, many linked to belief systems and selectively supported by colonial authorities. I think this is very important because this is where tradition comes in. You know, many indigenous societies and communities had practices. Some were patriarchal, negative, but not all of them were. And if we examine colonial history, what we will find is that the colonialists often supported those aspects of the structures that were patriarchal, because as patriarchs themselves, it made good sense, but they also supported those aspects of the culture that were useful to them, and they undermined those aspects of the culture that they didn't agree with or did not support their economic and political needs. So I think this is very important to note. So many of the practices, for example, related in many parts of the world, you'll find that it was the more patriarchal practices that were supported and encouraged and defined as tradition, as opposed to those that were more equitable or more gave women greater freedom and social value. So why have these harmful practices emerged and why do they continue? First of all, these harmful practices, and we will explain what some of those are later, they maintain the patriarchal social and economic systems and ensure their continuation. Very important. That's why each generation, in a way, has to almost do the same thing again, because there's this continuing mechanism that ensures the continuation. They facilitate the economic and domestic exploitation of women and girls' labor and their sexuality. And this is important. For example, if you look at unpaid housework or unpaid care work, that is based, one, on the acceptance of a sexual division of labor where women perform this work free of charge, and also it's based on a view that men and women need not share care work and housework. So there you end up with the economic and domestic exploitation of women and girls' labor and sexuality. It ensures that structured systems of patriarchal privilege are maintained, sometimes with the support of households and families, including sometimes older women, who in many traditions have the responsibility to police the behavior of younger women and men, and to maintain these patriarchal systems. And I think this is very important, where they're the ones who help maintain and reproduce these patriarchal systems. And these practices are hard to remove because they're often enshrined in cultural, customary, and religious rights linked to national, community, or religious identity. So for example, in the committee, many times when we ask people to change, they said, this is how we do it. This is how we've always done it. This is part of our tradition. This is part of our religion, etc., etc. Now, what are some of the examples of these harmful practices? We have widowhood rights, for example, and stigmatization and discriminatory practices. For example, in India, especially among Hindus, widows are not supposed to remarry. In some traditions, for example, in some parts of West Africa, if a man dies, his widow is isolated. In some instances, they shave her head, they take away all the belongings. She's just kind of blamed for the death of her husband. In fact, many countries, widows are blamed for their husband's death. And you have widow isolation and really horrible treatment. Then sometimes you have widow inheritance, where if a man dies, his brother can inherit the wife. So there are lots of practices around widowhood. And in fact, there's an International Association of Widows, which has really been campaigning on widows' rights. Practices related to menstruation, seen as polluting and unclean. And last month, we heard Bondage speak about the isolation of menstruating girls in Nepal. But this happens in other parts of the world where menstruating women are seen as unclean and polluting and some isolated in little huts or separate from the household, banned from attending religious ceremonies or religious places. And the only thing, one group that told me this is the only nice thing about it is that when you're menstruating, you end up not being cooking or cleaning. So you get a respite from that because you're considered unclean during that period. Then there's female genital mutilation at various levels, which was a practice in some parts of the world, but which from being on the committee, we realized sometimes it's spreading to places where it had never happened before. Then sun preference, that's a widespread phenomena. And related to that are sex-selective abortions. So in the past, sun preference might be dealt with by, for example, not feeding baby girls enough so they eventually die, or just simply killing baby girls. But now with modern technology, one can have sex-selective abortions so that you can find out the sex of the child before and then abort those that are female. Then there's also dowry and bride price and modern forms of that. And even though in some traditions, dowry may just have been a gift given to a bride at a marriage, in some parts of the world, for example, dowry now has become very capitalist. So like a family may need to give a car, a motor scooter, a television set, etc., which means that it increases son preference because parents don't really want to have daughters because daughters are a major financial burden. And what happened, I think it has reduced now in India, but like in the 80s, there was a problem of dowry murders where the families that had got these brides would actually arrange for these brides to die, usually from a kitchen disaster where the stove caught a fire. So then they can get another bride and get another dowry. So that's one. And then you have, of course, forced and early marriage, virginity tested, and more recently, again with technology, hymen replacement. In fact, in some situations, and I was reading about one of those cases recently, if even you never had penetrative sex, just to be sure, some women before they get married go and have it checked, and if necessary, have hymen replacement. Then, of course, the ritual bondage, food taboos. For example, in some traditions, women eat after men And therefore, if it's a poor household, they end up with less food. And all of our societies have what we call male food privilege, where we give men more food than women without asking the women if that's how much they want or need. And of course, polygamy and etc. So those are just a few of the harmful practices. But by far the most pervasive harmful practice is gender-based violence against women. Globally, 38.6% of all women who are killed in the world die at the hands of their partners, compared to 6.3% of men, according to a study from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So, you know, today, many times when we are organizing around November 5th, 25th, and they say, well, men are killed as well. But look, these are the global figures. Of course they are, but certainly not at the rate. So what is suggesting, not at the rate here that we are seeing. Yet so ingrained and taboo was this issue of violence against women in the popular imagination that in 1979, the CEDAW Convention did not specifically mention violence against women in its articles. And that was a shock to me. It was not until 1980, at the mid-decade conference in Copenhagen, that a clear statement on this was made. In section 5 of the report of that conference on battered women and the family, that section concluded by calling on member states to adopt measures to protect the victims of family violence and to implement programs whose aims are to prevent such abuse, as well as to provide centers for the treatment, shelter, and counseling of victims of violence and sexual assault, and to provide other services such as alcohol and drug abuse rehabilitation, housing, employment, childcare, and healthcare. As you will see, close to 62 years later, we still haven't done a lot of that. And I just wanted to show this. This is the Lucille Mathurin, Mayor of Jamaica, who at that time was UN Secretary General for the Mid-Decade Conference. And here she is addressing the opening ceremony of that conference that for the first time put on squarely on the UN agenda, the issue of violence against women as it was then known. Peggy Antrobus recalled these discussions at the Mid-Decade Conference in 1980. You may not know this, but Peggy Antrobus attended the 1975 International Women's Day Conference as director of the Jamaica Women's Bureau and also the Mid-Decade Conference. And she had this to say: for the first time, domestic and sexual violence were discussed along with the issue of female circumcision. These were not new issues for women, but their appearance on the agenda of a conference sponsored by a male-dominated institution was as much a tribute to the tenacity of women within the UN system and the female delegates who had political clout in their own countries, as it was to the men who aligned themselves with women in these difficult discussions. By the end of the decade conference in Nairobi, Kenya in 1985, violence against women appeared in paragraph 231 of the forward-looking strategies. Again, it stated that government should undertake effective measures, including mobilizing community resources to identify, prevent, and eliminate all violence, including family violence against women and children, and to provide shelter, support, and reorientation services for abused women and children. These measures should notably be aimed at making women conscious that maltreatment is not an incurable phenomenon, but a blow to their physical and moral integrity, against which they have the right and the duty to fight, whether they are themselves the victims or the witnesses. And again, the end of decade conference in Nairobi, the NGO forum of that conference was convened by our own again, Dame Nita Barrow of Barbados, So I think the message here is that Caribbean women have been at leadership positions since 1975 in the whole process towards women's emancipation and also addressing gender-based violence. So back to Article 5. Now, omission of violence against women and girls from the CEDAW Convention has been the source of much global debate, as this continues to be one of the consistent issues affecting women and girls worldwide. Nevertheless, from its very inception in 1982, the CEDAW Committee's dialogues with state parties have had a clear focus on violence against women and later gender-based violence against women. Initially, they addressed this through Articles 2, 5, 11, 12, and 16. Today, this is substantially addressed as part of Article 5. Of course, which we know relates to social and cultural patterns of conduct of men and women, harmful practices and stereotypes. And this is where it most naturally fits, as the key mechanism for maintaining discriminatory social and cultural patterns of conduct. In other words, gender-based violence serves to keep women in their place. It generates fear, and its continuity ensures that the system is maintained. And also, it is probably the most consistent and globally practiced harmful practice. Now, in all the constructive dialogues with states parties, gender-based violence is raised and included in all the concluding observations that result at the end of the dialogue. In some countries, the states parties circulate these concluding observations publicly and also inform the populations when they implement the CEDAW recommendations. In most of our societies, this is not the case. The concluding observations and recommendations remain hidden unless women's organizations, NGOs, civil society organizations monitor the concluding observations and lobby for their implementation. Of course, the states are very happy when this happens because they can implement, if they wish, and implement in their own time. And the only other support would be the follow-up mechanism within the CEDAW committee itself, which was discussed at the last session, at earlier sessions. Now, these dialogues and recommendations are, of course, shaped by the specific reality in each country. So, for example, in some countries you have FGM, in some you don't. But we shape the discussions and the recommendations around the specific situation in each country. And we draw on wide-ranging information and expertise in addressing these issues. We also learn from innovative practices in some countries and share this with other states parties in our dialogues and in our concluding observations. So I will explore some of this in relation to two Caribbean member states. First, the Dominican Republic, which was done earlier this year. And these are some extracts from the concluding observations. The committee notes, and if you notice, we always begin first by acknowledging what the state party has achieved. I know, because we try to be constructive. The committee notes that measures in place in the state party to respond to gender-based violence against women, including increased victim support services such as temporary shelters, medical treatment, and psychological and legal assistance. It also notes the adoption in 2020 of the first economic reparations and program for women victims of domestic violence. You see, that's an interesting thing, reparations for women victims, and fostering families of girls and boys orphaned by femicide, and the strategic plan for a life free from violence for women. However, the committee is concerned about the high incidence of gender-based violence against women and the delay in adopting the draft law on violence against women, which would specifically criminalize femicide and other forms of gender-based violence. It also notes with concern the absence of a unified system and procedure for recording reports of gender-based violence against women, the limited number of prosecutions and convictions, and the lenient sentences imposed on perpetrators of gender-based violence. So what did we recommend? We recommended that comprehensive law be adopted and implemented, that they should raise awareness that gender-based violence against forms. They also mentioned that we need to bear in mind the needs of persons with women with special needs in terms of accessibility of information for disadvantaged and marginalized groups of women, including women with disabilities. So for example, that information should be in Braille, it should be given through sign language, it should be available for persons who cannot move around. The gender-based violence shelters need to be physically accessible, etc., etc. Adopt gender-responsive protocols to unify procedures for reporting. I think that is something the entire region has been addressing. You know, you report to police, you report to the hospital, you report to different places, but they're all separate reports. But how do you bring these together in a database? Ensure that women and girls, including, and of here, we are being intersectional, recognizing the diversity of women's experiences and the need for all of these women who are victims of gender-based violence to have adequate access to medical, psychosocial, and legal assistance and to victim and witness protection programs. So you'll see it include refugee women, asylum seeking and migrant women, lesbian, bisexual, transgender women, and intersex persons, etc. And ensure that those officiating at wedding ceremonies for child or forced marriages or for instigating and facilitating forced early unions, that would be common law unions, are prosecuted and adequately punished. So that was one case. Sometimes you find that some of the observations and recommendations are similar because sometimes there's a lot of similarity in situations, although there may be a lot of diversity in situations as well. So now we look at the Bahamas, concluding observations of 2018. And here the committee welcomed the state's parties' measures to combat gender-based violence, for example, the establishment of the Domestic Violence and Counseling Unit, the appointment of the National Task Force for GBV, the development of a draft National Strategic Plan to address GBV, the measures taken by the Royal Bahamas Police Force and the Judiciary, such as the establishment of the Sexual Offences Unit in the Department of Public Prosecutions and the Swift Justice Initiative to address delays in access to justice. But we were concerned about the high prevalence of gender-based violence and the high reported incidents of hate crimes against lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women and intersex persons, which remain culturally accepted and underreported, the lack of a comprehensive law addressing violence against women, and delay in finalizing and adopting the draft bill on gender-based violence and the draft National Strategic Plan. The delay in the adoption of the draft amendments to the Sexual Offences Act that are fully in line with GR number 35 on gender-based violence against women, and the proposed amendment that would limit the right to file a complaint for marital rape to 1 year from the time of violation. Now, they were also concerned about the delay and absence of a time frame for establishment of a sexual offenders registry. And this one I put in bold, the prevalence of corporal punishment as a widely accepted means of disciplining children at school and home. And in many ways, it is important because the linking, we try to link, broadly contributing factors. And in many ways, and I hope I don't upset some people, this could be considered a harmful practice in some respects. We also mentioned the significant backlog in the court system of cases of violence against women and girls, the limited number of state-run shelters, the lack of data on cases of violence that have been on women and girls, the lack of data on cases that have been investigated and led to prosecution, and on the sanctions imposed on perpetrators, disaggregated by age and relationship between the victim and perpetrator. So I think from these two cases, you can get an example of how we address the depth with which the committee addresses gender-based violence in our constructive dialogues, which is one of the main actions of the committee. However, in addition to this, CEDAW has developed a number of additional mechanisms related to gender-based violence against women. For example, as you're probably aware, the general recommendations are developed to expand on, to develop on, or to update committee as well as states parties on how they should address certain challenges. So in 1989, the first general recommendation 12 on violence against women addressed violence against women in relation to all the articles of the convention. Then just 4 years later, 1992, there was General Recommendation 19 on violence against women, which was adopted in anticipation of the 1993 Vienna Conference on Human Rights. That Vienna Conference on Human Rights was very important because it was at that conference that rape was identified as a form of torture, and many aspects of violence against women were recognized as severe human rights violations. So there was a General Recommendation 99 that recognized the diversity of sites where violence against women took place, which included those committed by public authorities or private bodies, and they called again for the provision of reparations. Then in 2017, we had General Recommendation 35 on gender-based violence against women, which acknowledged the work that they acknowledged that the UN system had put a number of other mechanisms in place. For example, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, the special procedures, etc. And General Recommendation 35 was to provide further guidance and to accelerate the elimination of gender-based violence against women. In 1999, the optional protocol was put in place, and that had been a recommendation to the Vienna Human Rights Conference, and was adopted on Human Rights Day, and was a victory for women's movement activists, included feminist networks of lawyers on human rights, such as the International Women in the Law Project, and some of our Caribbean feminist lawyers were also part of this international network. And the optional protocol is implemented in the committee through two working groups, the Working Group on Communications, Article 2, and the Working Group on Inquiries, Article 8. And one of the main aims of this protocol was to improve the committee's ability to address violence against women. And this has turned out to be the most frequently addressed issue through these two working groups. The important thing about the optional protocol is that it allows for complaints from individuals, from groups or organizations, from those directly affected by the failure of a state party to comply with its obligations under the convention. And the work of the Communications Committee, which is very much a more legal committee, has developed an accumulated CEDAW jurisprudence, which is available for use in countries such as ours that have ratified the CEDAW Convention. And I think we need to do a lot more work with our judiciary in terms of the CEDAW Convention, which is not domesticated, I believe, in any of our jurisdictions, but whose jurisprudence is still available for us to use in our adjudications locally and regionally. And the CEDAW jurisprudence is binding and global in effect. The inquiry's procedure responds to receipt of reliable information indicating a state party's grave or systematic violation of human rights under the convention or failure to give effect to the convention's obligations. And we have had some very useful cases, again, many of them dealing with violence, but not just with violence. We have had one case about lack of access to abortion rights. We have had other cases. So I think that these inquiries are very broad and they address violence in many diverse manifestations. So therefore, this is just a summary of the two mechanisms, a simple summary, in case all the words I had on the last slide was a bit too much. Now, in addition to this, so overall, the UN system and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has developed a number of mechanisms to address violence against women and gender-based violence. Of course, you have the CEDAW recommendation, GR 12, GR 19, the Vienna, the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. In 1994, the establishment of a special rapporteur on violence against women, its causes and consequences. In 2017, the CEDAW General Recommendation 35, and in 2017, the launch of the platform of independent expert mechanisms on discrimination and violence against women, the EDVO platform, of which CEDAW is a member, along with the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence, UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women, the experts at the follow-up mechanism of the Bell and the Paro, the Inter-American System, that's us, the group of experts on action against violence against women, Grevio of the Council of Europe, and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa. And this platform is supposed to share ideas, share knowledge and experiences to strengthen each of our organizations, but generally the UN and the High Commission on Human Rights to address this issue. So I think that generally the CEDAW Committee has more than made up for the omission in its convention. And it has put detailed and in-depth focus on gender-based violence, holding states accountable and also adjudicating on individual and organizational requests for attention for matters to be addressed. What is also important is CEDAW has also set up its own working group on violence against women, of which both Marian and I are members, which really in a way seeks to coordinate and to bring together all of these efforts within the committee. So in conclusion then, I can say that while much of the human rights focus on gender-based violence against women has tended to be on the legal aspects. The CEDAW Convention recognizes that harmful practices, including gender-based violence against women, must also be addressed by confronting and transforming social, cultural, and gender ideologies, stereotypes, belief systems, and harmful practices, and importantly, through the involvement of women and men in childcare, as mentioned in Article 5. As Rashida Manjoo, the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women between June 2009 and July 2015 concludes, states must acknowledge that violence against women is not the root problem, but that violence occurs because other forms of discrimination are allowed to flourish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very thorough presentation. I think this has been really helpful in understanding Article 5 and how it can be used to address gender-based violence, but also giving us some context. I think it was really great to be able to look at the concluding observations for Dominican Republic as well as the Bahamas. We will be opening up for questions, comments, challenges, ideas, thoughts at this point. So please start to think about what you'd like to ask or what you'd like to share. You can use the chat, or you can just raise your hand to indicate that you'd like to unmute to use the opportunity to speak. That is very much welcome. Do we have any questions, or are people still mulling it over? Give folks a moment to gather thoughts. I did want to know if you, Rhoda, have any thoughts about, you mentioned, I think twice, reparations when it comes to gender-based violence. Do you have thoughts on what that looks like? Are there examples of that already, or is this something that we still need to imagine for ourselves?
I think that some countries have implemented it. I think the Dominican Republic, they do have a system of reparations. But I think reparations can take different forms. They could be financial. They could be that you can ask the perpetrator to do certain things for the person involved. Or so I think that there could be different ways, you know, that it could be done. That maybe the perpetrator would have to agree to perform certain practices, or to pay give financial reparations. I think in some instances that's the form that it takes. So, and I think that we can think about that, because I think that there are examples in other parts of the world, and perhaps Marian could share that as well, the examples from other parts of the world.
Right. So yes, Rhoda, you're quite right. Certainly under the communications, the optional protocol, we, in terms of gender-based violence, we ask for reparations for women who've been physically and psychologically harmed. And so the perpetrator then has to, is asked to pay for any medical costs, psychosocial support programs, etc. And any other outlay that the survivor has sustained, the state or the perpetrator is asked to, yes, make reparations in those areas. So it depends on the specific situation of what reparations may look like. But yes, it takes different forms in different places. Thank you.
You also talked about education on gender-based violence and the responsibility of the state to ensure that people have an understanding of what gender-based violence is. And it seems like that's an area that's lacking, I think, in many of our countries, particularly in the region. We are still sort of arguing about what constitutes gender-based violence, and that's sort of the interpersonal level as well as the structural level. Do you have any ideas about what we should be doing, what we should be advocating for the state to do, but also what civil society actors can be doing to increase education about gender-based violence?
Well, I think that in some parts of the region, we do know what gender-based violence is because we do have gender-based violence laws. And so in Trinidad and Tobago, our law has been amended for the third time with substantial NGO and civil society and women's organization consultation and input. So we have been expanding and refining the understanding of gender-based violence. But I think that in our part, in Trinidad and Tobago as well, and other parts of the region, I think people have been trying to do education on gender-based violence. But for me, as part of that, and this is why Article 5 is so important, you also have to do education on the gendered structures, the patriarchal structures within society that maintain and reproduce it. The ideologies, the stereotypes, the myths, the stigmatization. That's where I think a lot of the education has to be. And we have actually been recommending not just comprehensive sexuality education, but also gender sensitive comprehensive, and in other words, gender knowledge or gender understanding of human reality has to be part of curriculum. We argue for teachers, in parenting programs, in schools, etc.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else have any questions? I mean, I can sit here and ask questions for the remaining time, but I'm sure.
I think there's some in the chat.
Oh, we have one here, yes. Can you expand your comments on the judiciary and the CEDAW jurisprudence?
Okay. Well, of course, I'm not a legal practitioner, but my understanding is that the CEDAW jurisprudence can be cited in our courts in cases related to domestic violence or other issues that come before, especially the Communications Committee. But I think even the CEDAW articles can be cited in our courts in cases related to gender-based violence and cases related to other aspects of gender inequality. But I think, as I said before, that this region is probably the one, in my opinion, where the CEDAW is less domesticated, not only in law, but generally. And that is why this activity that you are having here, Equality Bahamas, is so important, because we see civil society groups and organizations coming from all parts of the world. Sometimes some of the parts of the world where women's situation is so difficult, but yet has been in a way missing. And I think that part of your work and our work is to get the Caribbean much more aware of the UN human rights bodies in general, and the work of CEDAW in particular. So I think that special focus on the judicial system in terms of the CEDAW process, its jurisprudence, as well as its articles, I think would be very important. I think now in the law school, there's a new course introduced, certainly at St. Augustine, it's probably elsewhere, on not the law school, the Faculty of Law, on human rights law. So I think within that, hopefully, they would be addressing some of these human rights institutions and how they can be used in domestic jurisdictions. I'm sure Marian can say much more about it.
Yes, I'll just add to what you're saying, Rhoda, and that is that, you know, there are two strains of thought on this. That if the country, let's take the Caribbean region, has not domesticated or made it part of our laws, that is the convention, then it has no validity within our court system. But that is, you know, in practice, what happens, and I've seen it, is that there are several cases throughout the Caribbean where advocates have invoked the CEDAW Convention, and courts have taken notice of it. In other words, it is persuasive at this point. It is not part of the legal architecture in the way that the court can actually stand on it. But the court takes notice of the fact that the country has ratified the convention, and the country has signaled in this way that it intends and should and ought to be bound by what it has ratified. And so courts take notice of the CEDAW Convention. I've got several cases where that is so, and it persuades the courts in certain directions in terms of grounding itself in this particular human right. And I've seen findings of the court that really adhere to what the convention is about. And so it is important for our lawyers to really have the kind of capacity building and training in the convention, and to become more confident in invoking the convention, even where the domestication is not complete and absolute, because courts will take notice of it and ground their findings based on the ratification itself.
Thank you. And the person who asked the question also extends their thanks. Do we have any other questions? Does anyone want to type into the chat or unmute? Just let us know. We're coming to the end. Someone's saying, I think this is to you, Marion, that it would be helpful to have those examples for further advocacy.
Yes, I can. Tell me where to send them, please. I don't have them at my fingertips right now, but I'd be happy to share them. The cases that I have. Yes, if somebody can just tell me where to send them.
Yes. Okay, they put the email in the chat. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments? I think before we go, go ahead.
Yeah, I just like to ask and put this out and ask Rhoda for her comments. It seems to me that, gender-based violence, particularly intimate partner violence, where we're talking about, let's say, marital rape or domestic violence, I'm just trying to understand, the entrenchment and the unrelenting persistence of patriarchy within the intimate partner sphere, the domestic sphere. In other words, we've had some advances in areas like employment and education for women, but it seems as though even in political participation, there are advances that we can point to. But it seems that this issue of gender-based violence is such an intimate issue, and patriarchy is so entrenched at that level. And we don't see any increase in advances in terms of the betterment of gender-based violence, as you pointed out. And I'm just trying to articulate for myself, what is this about? Why is the intimate sphere, the unrelenting, frontier where patriarchy is so persistent, so harmful, and there seems to be very little progress around the world in terms of gender-based violence and its entrenchment around rape, domestic violence, etc. Even in places like the Nordic countries, where we've had them come before us, and they're supposed to be the highest in terms of gender equality indexes, etc., indices. And we found that this issue of gender-based violence in Norway, for example, was prevalent. So I'm trying to understand, what is it where patriarchy relents in some areas, but this specific area of gender-based violence is unrelenting, it seems. Can you just speak to that a little bit? I know it's a lot, but I'd like to hear your articulation of it. Thank you.
Right, yes. Well, this, of course, is the crux of the matter. I think that intimate partner violence it happens within the family. And the family in many societies is a patriarchal institution that was based on the control of women. And I mean, these are very deep questions because in the earliest pre-colonial societies, the control of women, is important because it's through the control of women that men get access to children, first of all, to their own children. So as soon as you have societies where there's property there and the name where private property has evolved, women become the first source of private property. And then with women as the first source of private property, you then get access to children, land, and other forms of private property. So the family in many societies, the family that we know, the male head, the female children, even extended, was inherently a patriarchal institution. And that has been amended in many parts of the world. You'll find that countries that did not have this very high level of structure and hierarchy, families may have been more egalitarian. There would be less concern about the fatherhood of children, whereas children would become to a community, and in many really truly matrilineal lines, children would be traced along the mother's line. So the uncle would be more important than the actual father. It's a lot to explain now. So you have the family then as society becomes more alienating, more oppressive, for many people, the family is where you're supposed to be able to be yourself. And for many men, the family is the place where you can exercise your authority. But the family is also a small space where people get on each other's nerves, where men feel that if even I'm treated badly outside, at least in my home, at least here, I can have control and power. And therefore, families and households are very vulnerable positions. And that's why I think one of the biggest gains of the women's movement is to open up the family for, let's say, state intervention. Because in the past, the family was considered private, that whole public-private divide. The state couldn't intervene, and many laws actually allowed men to kill women, and made it easier for them to do so. But I think one of the big achievements of the women's movement was to delegitimize violence against women and to criminalize family violence, which is a major shift in patriarchal structures. And therefore, you always find these efforts to go against it, to fight against it, to reinstate that patriarchal control. So it's a big issue, and we just have, that is why for me, the sensitization, the education is so important on the root causes of gender-based violence if we are to change it.
Thank you. Last call for questions, comments. I think this has been really helpful in giving us quite a lot to think about and a lot to plan in terms of how we continue to do our work to end gender-based violence and mobilize and work together to use the convention, understanding that it's not something that just gets ratified and put on a shelf and just taken down every 4 years for a review session, but that we actually need to work it and to engage with different groups of people, including the judiciary. I think that might be an area that we can put more attention and be able to actually get some more traction and have more conversations and see the convention in action. I think that's what we really want, is for it to not just be a document, but something that we're integrating into our laws and practices and use it to change our lives. Our next session will be next month We are still working out the date. We're having some scheduling complications, but we will get it sorted within the coming days and let you know the date and the time for the next event. It will likely be on a Saturday. Hopefully we will maintain the same time slot where it's 10 a.m. in the Bahamas. The recordings for all of the previous sessions in the series are on our YouTube channel. They are in the chat for those of you who are on Zoom, and those of you who are watching the recording on YouTube, you already have access to that playlist, and we will continue to populate that. If you would like to have a look at the slides from this presentation, you can find them at tiny.cc/CEDAW, that's CEDAW, Rhoda, RHODA. So it's very easy if you want to find the slides from any session. It will always be tiny.cc/CEDAW, and then the first name of the expert that's joining us on that day. For Equality Bahamas, we have Women's Wednesdays coming up. That's on Wednesday, August 24th at 6 p.m. We are really excited to be joined by Hannah Baird, who is a young woman who recently purchased property and during the pandemic built her first investment property. She's now a homeowner, and she's also a real estate agent. So she'll be talking with us about how you purchase property from finding it or finding a home to getting pre-qualified, going through that whole process, all of the costs that you don't really know about, and the people that you need on your team to be able to have this accomplishment. So please join us for that session. You can register at tiny.cc/WWHouse. And the last thing is we have a youth advocacy training coming up, particularly targeting people between the ages of 16 and 25 who want to learn more about gender equal nationality law. So you all know that we had the referendum in 2016. It was a no vote, but it does not end there. We need to see these changes. We need to see gender inequality and nationality law rectified through legislation for now, but we also need to hold another referendum so this right is enshrined in the Constitution. So we're training young people to become advocates, and so that when the referendum comes up again, we have more people who are ready to mobilize and to share information with a wider group of people and ensure that we get the vote that we need. Those interested, please check out the application that has more information on it, tiny.cc/youth, the number 4 nationality. It's tiny.cc/youth, the number 4 nationality. And those trainings will be held on September 3rd and September 10th, both Saturdays. Thank you everyone for joining us for this session and for listening so intently. I'm sure that everyone has lots of thoughts. And if you have anything that you think of later on, please feel free to send us an email if you'd like us to share a question or an idea. We can always send that email for you. Just contact us at equalitybahamas@gmail.com. And did you want to say some closing words, Rhoda?
Yes, I just wanted to say thanks so much to you and Equality Bahamas and to Marian for this excellent initiative. I am wondering if I overwhelmed everyone because there's no questions. However, I hope that that maybe people can send questions or comments to me after, maybe after they've read the presentation, and so we can continue the discussions. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for being here with us and putting together this presentation, making the slides available for everyone to review in their own time and sharing your expertise. I think this was a really valuable session and one that we can go back to again and again. And thankfully we have the recording. So we did eventually get live on Facebook, and we have the recording that will be on YouTube. I'll make sure that that's up within the next 24 hours. And yes, please do send your questions and comments. I know that sometimes it takes a bit of time and energy to really absorb the information, especially if you're not particularly familiar with CEDAW. So do take your time and feel free to get in touch whenever it's comfortable for you. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.